Thomas Brennan had 3 bullets in his chest and 10 minutes to live when he heard the baby crying. What he didn't know, this wasn't just any baby. This was the grandson of the most feared Comanche war chief in Texas. And in 30 minutes, 50 warriors would surround his cabin, demanding answers Thomas couldn't give. But first, he had to crawl 200 yards through his own blood to save a child who should have been his enemy. 14 minutes of hell had turned Thomas Brennan's ranch into a killing field. But those 14 minutes were nothing compared to the nightmare he faced now. Trapped beneath his dead horse with 3 bullets in his chest, watching his blood soak into Texas dirt while somewhere in the smoke, an innocent baby was dying alone. The smart choice was obvious. Conserve his strength, pray someone found him before he bled out. But that baby's cries were getting weaker, and Thomas knew with gut-wrenching certainty that in 5 minutes, maybe less, those cries would stop forever. What he didn't know was that every second he hesitated brought 50 mounted Comanche warriors closer to his ranch, following a blood trail that would lead them straight to their war chief's missing grandson. The memory hit him like a physical blow, his own son Samuel's final moments 3 winters back, when scarlet fever had burned through the boy's small body, while Thomas held him helplessly through the night. Mary had died 6 months later, unable to bear a world without their child, leaving Thomas alone on a ranch that felt more like a tomb than a home. He'd sworn over their graves that he'd never again stand by while an innocent suffered, regardless of the cost. But this was different. This was suicide disguised as mercy. The baby's cries came again, weaker now, barely audible over the crackling of burning wagons and the moans of dying soldiers. Thomas could see him through the smoke, a tiny bundle wrapped in what looked like an ornate cradleboard, lying beside the still form of a Comanche woman whose jewelry caught the firelight even in death. Thomas began the agonizing process of dragging himself out from under his horse's crushing weight. The animal had taken 2 rifle balls meant for him, its sacrifice buying Thomas these precious minutes of life. But now that life was measured in heartbeats, and each one brought him closer to a choice that would define his final moments on Earth. Around him, the battlefield told the story of mutual destruction. Young cavalry soldiers lay twisted in death, their blue uniforms darkened with blood, letters from sweethearts scattered in the dust. Comanche warriors who would never see their families again stared sightlessly at the Texas sky, their war paint mixing with crimson streams that fed the thirsty ground. But none of that mattered now. Nothing mattered except the sound of that baby's weakening cries and the knowledge that Thomas Brennan was the only person in 50 miles who could do anything about it. He began to crawl. Thomas began dragging himself toward the cries, each movement painting fresh crimson across the battlefield. 50 yards. His vision blurred. 100 yards. He could taste copper with every breath. 150. The baby's wails were growing fainter, or maybe that was just Thomas losing consciousness. That's when he saw the riders on the horizon. Dark silhouettes moving fast across the prairie, at least 20 of them, maybe more, coming straight toward the battlefield where he lay bleeding and exposed, carrying a baby that, if his growing suspicions were correct, belonged to the very warriors thundering toward them with weapons drawn and vengeance in their hearts. Thomas pressed his face against the dirt, watching those distant figures grow larger with each passing second. The riders moved with military precision, spreading out as they approached, their formation speaking of years spent perfecting the art of war. These weren't random raiders or desperate survivors. This was a war party with a specific purpose, and Thomas was about to discover what that purpose was. He forced himself to keep crawling, driven by desperation and the fading cries ahead. The ground beneath him was a maze of obstacles, broken weapons, scattered supplies, and bodies that had been men with hopes and fears just an hour ago. But Thomas pushed through it all, following the sound of innocent suffering like a compass pointing toward his final act of human decency. Behind him, the hoofbeats were getting closer. He could hear individual voices now, calling to each other in the Comanche tongue, coordinating their approach to the battlefield where their people had died. In minutes, maybe less, they would crest the ridge and see everything. The carnage, the burning wagons, and a white rancher crawling through the blood with their chief's grandson in his arms. The baby's cries suddenly stopped. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat, terror flooding through him like ice water. Had he failed? Had he spent his final minutes of life on a hopeless gesture while a child died just yards away from salvation? He pushed himself harder, ignoring the lightning bolts of pain that shot through his shattered ribs with every movement. But when he finally reached the spot where the cries had been coming from, Thomas's mouth fell open in shock. When Thomas finally reached the baby, his blood turned to ice water. The cradleboard's intricate beadwork wasn't just beautiful, it was royal. The kind of craftsmanship reserved for the children of war chiefs. And lying beside the infant was a woman whose jewelry marked her as Comanche nobility, probably the daughter of someone whose name struck fear into cavalry officers across 3 states. The baby's dark eyes locked onto Thomas's face, and the crying stopped. In that moment of perfect silence, Thomas heard something that made his heart hammer against his shattered ribs. War cries. Close. Getting closer. The riders weren't just coming to investigate the battle. They were coming to collect their dead. And when they arrived, they'd find a white rancher holding their chief's grandson in his dying arms. But it was what Thomas saw next that made him understand the full scope of what he'd stumbled into. The dead woman beside the baby wore a medallion around her neck, a silver disc engraved with symbols that even Thomas, isolated as he'd been, recognized as marks of the highest Comanche nobility. This wasn't just any warrior's daughter. This was royalty. The baby reached up with one tiny hand, grasping Thomas's blood-stained finger with surprising strength. Despite everything, the battle, the approaching warriors, the certainty of death, little Wolf's eyes held no fear, only the universal trust that infants place in any adult who shows them kindness. "Easy there, little one," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "Uncle Thomas won't let anything happen to you." But even as he spoke the words, Thomas knew they might be lies. The war cries were getting louder, accompanied now by the thunder of many horses moving at full gallop. He could see dust clouds rising from multiple directions. This wasn't just one war party, but several, all converging on the battlefield where he lay bleeding and exposed. Thomas gathered the cradleboard into his arms, marveling at how light the baby felt despite the solid weight of approaching responsibility. The child's breathing was steady, his color good despite the trauma he'd witnessed. Whatever had happened to his mother, she'd protected him with her life until the very end. The ornate beadwork on the cradleboard told stories and patterns Thomas couldn't read, but he could recognize quality craftsmanship when he saw it. This had been made by master artisans, probably taking months to complete, each bead placed with love and hope for the child who would wear it. Now that child was an orphan, dependent on the kindness of a dying stranger who might not live long enough to see him to safety. But safety was a relative term when 50 Comanche warriors were about to discover a white rancher holding their war chief's grandson. The first war party crested the eastern ridge like a vision from hell. 20 mounted Comanche warriors painted for battle, their weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun. But Thomas noticed something that gave him a sliver of hope. Their formation wasn't aggressive. They rode like men searching for something precious, not attacking an enemy position. Behind them came a second group, then a third, all converging on the battlefield with the coordinated precision of a military operation. As they drew closer, Thomas could make out individual faces, each one marked by the kind of controlled fury that came from discovering slaughtered kinsmen. But it was the figure leading the central group that made Thomas's blood freeze in his veins. Even from 200 yards away, there was no mistaking the legendary war chief Quanah Parker, a man whose very name was whispered in terror from San Antonio to El Paso. Half Comanche, half white, completely deadly, Parker had united the scattered Comanche bands into a force that had turned the Texas frontier into a running battlefield. And Thomas was about to meet him while holding what he now knew with sick certainty was Parker's own grandson. The war parties spread out as they approached, surrounding the battlefield in a wide circle that cut off any possibility of escape. Not that Thomas was in any condition to run. 50 warriors on horseback created a living wall of bronze flesh and war paint, their presence transforming the empty prairie into an arena where Thomas would face judgment for crimes he'd never committed. Parker dismounted 100 yards away and began walking slowly through the carnage, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the massacre. He moved like a predator, each step calculated, his very stillness radiating the kind of contained violence that had made him the most feared warrior in 3 territories. Other war chiefs followed his lead, dismounting and spreading out through the battlefield to count their dead and search for survivors. Thomas watched them discover bodies of warriors he didn't recognize, men who had ridden to battle expecting victory and found only death. Each discovery seemed to harden their expressions, building a reservoir of rage that would soon need an outlet. That's when one of the younger warriors spotted Thomas. The man shouted something in Comanche that brought every head snapping in Thomas's direction. Suddenly 50 pairs of eyes were focused on the white rancher holding their chief's grandson, and the weight of their collective attention felt like a physical force pressing down on his chest. Parker stopped his examination of the battlefield and turned toward Thomas, his face unreadable but his hand moving to rest on the tomahawk at his belt. When he began walking in Thomas's direction, the other warriors fell silent, understanding that they were about to witness something that would be remembered in tribal songs for generations to come. But it was what the baby did that shocked everyone present. Instead of crying or reaching for his grandfather, Little Wolf tightened his grip on Thomas's finger and made a soft, contented sound, the kind of noise infants make when they feel safe and protected. The effect on the assembled warriors was immediate and startling. Several of them exchanged glances that spoke of recognition rather than hostility, understanding that children possessed an instinct for judging character that transcended adult prejudices and tribal loyalties. Parker stopped 10 feet away, close enough that Thomas could see the intelligence burning in his dark eyes, the calculation of a leader trying to understand how a white rancher had come to be holding his grandson in the middle of a battlefield littered with the bodies of both their peoples. The war party hit the ridge like a thunderclap. 50 mounted Comanche warriors spread across the horizon, their war paint gleaming in the afternoon sun, weapons ready for the kind of vengeance that left no survivors. At their head rode a figure Thomas recognized with sick certainty. Quanah Parker, the half-white, half-Comanche war chief whose name was whispered in terror from San Antonio to El Paso. Parker's eyes found Thomas immediately, locking onto the white rancher who dared to hold what was obviously a Comanche child. The war chief's face was unreadable, but his hand rested on his tomahawk in a way that suggested Thomas had about 30 seconds to explain why he deserved to keep breathing. "White man," Parker said, his voice carrying absolute authority as he dismounted and began walking through the carnage. "You hold something that belongs to us." But it was what the baby did next that shocked everyone present. Instead of crying or reaching for his grandfather, Little Wolf grasped Thomas's blood-stained finger with both tiny hands and held on, as if this dying stranger was the only anchor keeping him from drowning in a world gone mad. The silence that followed was deafening. 50 warriors watched their war chief process this impossible scene, his grandson clinging to a white man who should have been his mortal enemy. Several of the younger braves shifted nervously in their saddles, uncertain how to interpret what they were witnessing. Parker knelt beside Thomas, his weathered face inches away, close enough that Thomas could see the mixed heritage that had made this man a bridge between 2 worlds at war. "This child bears the mark of Chief Parker's bloodline," he said quietly, his English precise despite the accent. "He is my daughter's son, my grandson, the future of our people. How does he come to be in your arms?" Thomas tried to sit up straighter, succeeding only in sending fresh waves of agony through his chest. Blood bubbled at the corners of his mouth when he tried to speak, but he forced the words out anyway. "I heard him crying," he whispered. "Found him beside his mother. She was already gone." Parker's gaze shifted to the dead woman near the creek, and something flickered across his features. Grief quickly suppressed, but unmistakably real. "Morning Star," he said softly. "My daughter. She came to trade with the cavalry under a flag of truce. Your soldiers had other ideas." The weight of understanding settled over Thomas like a burial shroud. This hadn't been a battle between equal forces. This had been a massacre of peace negotiators, civilians who had come in good faith only to be cut down by men who saw profit in continued warfare. "Why?" Parker asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Why would a white man crawl through his own blood to save the grandson of his enemy?" Thomas met the war chief's eyes, finding strength he didn't know he still possessed. "Because 3 years ago, I buried my own son. Same age as this one. Scarlet fever took him, and his mother followed 6 months later. I swore on their graves I'd never let another child suffer if I could prevent it. He paused, gathering what little breath remained to him. Doesn't matter what color they are. Pain is pain. Love is love. And children are children. Parker stared at this impossible scene, his grandson refusing to let go of a dying white man who should have been his enemy. Something flickered in the war chief's eyes, and Thomas realized with growing amazement that it wasn't anger. It was recognition. This child is Little Wolf, son of my daughter Morning Star, Parker said, his voice deadly quiet. She died protecting him from your cavalry. Tell me why I shouldn't gut you where you lay and feed you to the buzzards. Thomas met the war chief's eyes, tasting blood but finding strength he didn't know he still possessed. Because 3 years ago, I buried my own son, same age as this one, and I swore on his grave I'd never let another child suffer if I could prevent it. The silence that followed stretched like a bowstring about to snap. 50 warriors watched their chief decide whether mercy or murder would rule this moment. But it was the baby who cast the deciding vote, looking up at Parker with perfect trust before turning back to Thomas's face with the same expression. Even hardened Comanche warriors understood the language of innocent trust. And right now, Chief Quanah Parker's grandson was choosing the white rancher who'd crawled through hell to save him. But the moment of potential understanding was shattered by a new sound. More riders approaching from the west, these moving with different energy entirely. The war cries that echoed across the prairie carried a note of triumph rather than mourning, and Thomas felt his blood turn to ice as he recognized what was coming. A cavalry patrol, drawn by the smoke and flames, arriving to investigate the battle. And when they crested that ridge and saw 50 Comanche warriors surrounding a white rancher, they wouldn't pause to ask questions or seek explanations. They would simply open fire and sort out the details later. Parker heard them too, his head snapping toward the approaching sound with the alertness of a predator sensing danger. Around the circle, his warriors were already reaching for their weapons, preparing for a fight that would turn this battlefield into an even greater slaughter. Blue coats, one of the younger warriors called out in English, his voice tight with anticipation. 20 riders, maybe more. Thomas felt the situation spiraling beyond any hope of control. In minutes, two forces that had been bleeding each other white for decades would clash again, and he would be caught in the middle holding a baby whose presence would guarantee that no quarter was asked or given. But it was what Parker did next that defied every expectation Thomas had about how this would unfold. Instead of mounting up and preparing for battle, the war chief made a gesture that stunned his own warriors. He handed his weapons to the brave beside him and knelt back down beside Thomas, placing his hand on the white rancher's forehead in what was unmistakably a gesture of respect. You speak truth, Parker said quietly, his voice carrying only far enough for Thomas to hear. I see it in my grandson's choice, in the way he holds to you despite knowing nothing of your people or your ways. Children know things that adults forget. He paused, listening to the approaching cavalry with the ear of a man who had fought them for years. But knowing truth and surviving truth are different things. When those soldiers arrive, they will see only enemies. They will not pause to understand that you saved a Comanche child or that I honor you for it. They will shoot first and count the dead later. Thomas struggled to focus through the pain and blood loss, understanding that Parker was offering him something precious, a choice in how his story would end. What are you saying? I am saying that you have earned the right to die as a warrior, Parker replied. Among my people, among yours, or caught between them. Your choice. The cavalry riders were close enough now to make out individual uniforms, their formation speaking of military discipline and the kind of racial hatred that had fueled decades of frontier warfare. Thomas could see their weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun, could almost hear the orders that would send bullets flying in all directions. But looking down at Little Wolf, this innocent child who had somehow survived a massacre and found comfort in the arms of a dying stranger, Thomas realized his choice had already been made. I want to live long enough to see him safe, Thomas whispered. That's all. Just long enough to know he'll grow up. Parker smiled for the first time since arriving at the battlefield, an expression that transformed his face from stern authority to something almost paternal. Then that is what will happen. What the war chief did next would be talked about around both Comanche and white campfires for generations to come. Instead of preparing for battle with the approaching cavalry, Parker stood and raised his hand in the universal sign of parley, calling out in English that carried clearly across the prairie. "We come in peace to collect our dead," he shouted. "We have no quarrel with soldiers who honor the rules of war." The cavalry patrol reined in their horses at the edge of rifle range, their captain, a young officer with lieutenant's bars, clearly struggling to process what he was seeing. 50 Comanche warriors had the tactical advantage but weren't using it, and a white civilian was somehow at the center of it all. "Who speaks for the whites?" the lieutenant called back, his voice cracking slightly with nerves. Parker looked down at Thomas with something that might have been amusement. "That would be you, I believe. Think you can manage one more conversation?" Thomas nodded weakly, understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether this battlefield claimed even more lives or whether something unprecedented might emerge from the carnage. He cleared his throat and called out in the strongest voice he could manage. "Thomas Brennan, rancher. These warriors came to collect their dead, same as you probably came to collect yours. No need for more killing today." The lieutenant dismounted and began walking slowly toward the circle of Comanche warriors, his hand resting on his saber but not drawing it. As he got closer, Thomas could see he was younger than he'd first appeared, probably fresh from some Eastern military academy where they taught tactics from books rather than experience. "Lieutenant Morrison, 3rd Cavalry," the officer said, his voice steadier now that he was committed to the conversation. "We received reports of an Indian attack on this sector. I see evidence of battle, but—" He paused, clearly confused by the scene before him. "But you don't see any fighting," Parker finished for him. "Because the fighting is over. Your soldiers and our warriors are dead. Now we collect our fallen and mourn our losses. Unless you prefer to add to those losses unnecessarily." Lieutenant Morrison's gaze moved from Parker to Thomas to the baby in the rancher's arms, his young face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been understanding. "You're holding an Indian child," he observed. "I'm holding a baby whose mother died in this fight," Thomas corrected gently. "Same as I'd hold any child who needed help." The officer stared at Thomas for a long moment, and Thomas could see the war happening behind his eyes. Duty versus humanity, orders versus conscience. Around them, both forces waited to see which way the wind would blow. Finally, Lieutenant Morrison made a decision that would define his entire military career. "We'll collect our dead and withdraw," he announced. "But I want it understood that any further hostilities will not come from us," Parker interrupted smoothly. "We have what we came for." As the two forces began the grim work of collecting their fallen, Thomas felt his strength finally beginning to ebb. The blood loss was catching up with him, and each breath came harder than the last. But Little Wolf was safe, surrounded by his grandfather's warriors and acknowledged by the cavalry as under protection rather than threat. Parker knelt beside Thomas one final time as the rancher's vision began to blur around the edges. "You asked to live long enough to see him safe," the war chief said quietly. "Look around you. 50 warriors will guard his life with their own. A cavalry patrol has recognized his right to live in peace. You have given him something more precious than safety. You have given him hope that whites and Comanche can choose understanding over hatred." Thomas looked down at the baby in his arms, seeing not a Comanche child or a symbol of tribal warfare, but simply an innocent life that deserved a chance to grow up in a world less violent than the one that had orphaned him. Little Wolf's dark eyes met his, and Thomas could swear he saw understanding there, recognition of the sacrifice being made on his behalf. "What will happen to him?" Thomas whispered. "He will grow up knowing that a white rancher died to save him," Parker replied. "He will learn both our ways and yours, becoming a bridge between worlds that have forgotten how to speak to each other. And when he is old enough to understand, he will visit your grave and honor the man who chose love over fear." What happened next defied every treaty, every battle, every moment of hatred that had defined the Texas frontier for a generation. Quanah Parker, the most feared war chief in Comanche history, knelt beside a dying white rancher and placed his hand on Thomas's forehead. "I speak the crossing prayer for you, Thomas Brennan," Parker said, his voice carrying ceremony that transcended race and tribal loyalty. "Any man who crawls through a battlefield to save a child is the finest kind of warrior, one who fights not for conquest, but for life itself." As the sun set over the Texas prairie, Thomas Brennan closed his eyes for the last time, surrounded by 50 Comanche warriors who had expected to find enemies and instead discovered what it meant to choose love over fear. The baby, Little Wolf, slept peacefully in his grandfather's arms, unaware that the white rancher who'd saved him would become a legend. But the story was far from over. Because what Quanah Parker did next would reshape the relationship between two peoples who had been at war for generations, proving that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought with weapons at all, but with the simple courage to recognize enemies as family. 3 days later, when cavalry patrols found Thomas's ranch, they discovered something that military reports couldn't explain. Comanche symbols carved into his fence post reading, "Here lived a man who chose children over conflict." And beside his family grave stood a war chief's lance, tribute from a legendary enemy to a fallen friend who had proven that individual acts of compassion could still change the world. The grave itself was a marvel that spoke to the profound impact of Thomas's final act. Comanche craftsmen had worked alongside cavalry soldiers to create a monument that honored both traditions. White marble carved with Christian symbols surrounded by stones arranged in patterns sacred to the Comanche people. It was the first time in frontier history that the two cultures had collaborated on anything, and it happened because a dying rancher had chosen to save an enemy's child. Lieutenant Morrison, the young cavalry officer who had witnessed Thomas's final moments, went on to become one of the most respected peacekeepers on the frontier. He would later write in his memoirs that watching a white rancher and Comanche war chief pray together over a baby had taught him more about leadership than 4 years at West Point. But perhaps the most remarkable legacy was Little Wolf himself. Raised by his grandfather but educated in both traditions, he grew up to become the first Native American admitted to Harvard Law School, eventually returning to Texas as a federal mediator specializing in disputes between white settlers and tribal communities. Throughout his distinguished career, Little Wolf carried with him a small wooden cross carved from timber taken from Thomas Brennan's ranch, a reminder of the white rancher who had crawled through hell to save a stranger's baby. And when historians asked what had inspired his lifelong dedication to peaceful coexistence, he would always tell them about a dying man who had taught him that love was stronger than tribal loyalty, compassion more powerful than ancient hatred. The battlefield where Thomas made his final choice eventually became the site of the Brennan Peace Memorial, the first monument in Texas history to honor both white and Native American casualties of frontier warfare. School children from both communities visit it together, learning about the rancher who proved that individual acts of kindness could reshape the destiny of nations. And every year on the anniversary of that day, descendants of both Thomas Brennan and Quanah Parker gather at the memorial to share stories and remember the lesson that a dying rancher taught them all, that in the end, children matter more than conquests, love more than loyalty, and the courage to choose compassion over hatred was the greatest victory any warrior could achieve.